On December 26, 1913, flames consumed Detroit's downtown train depot at 3rd and Jefferson. The fire started at 2:10 p.m. in the afternoon, and within hours, the building that had served Michigan Central Railroad for 29 years was a smoking shell. Railroad executives had exactly one problem. Thousands of passengers needed to board trains, and they needed to do it today. 3 miles southwest in the neighbourhood called Corktown stood a building that wasn't quite finished. The waiting room wasn't done, the tower offices sat empty, painters were still working in the corridors, but it had platforms, and it had tracks, and at 5:20 that evening, the first train departed from Michigan Central Station bound for Saginaw. The station that would become Detroit's Cathedral was rushed into service 6 months early, baptized by crisis before it was even dedicated. The architects who designed it, Warren and Wetmore, had just finished Grand Central Terminal in New York. Michigan Central was meant to be Grand Central's spiritual twin, another Beaux-Arts monument to America's railroad age. The building rose 18 floors above Roosevelt Park, taller than any train station in the world. The waiting room stretched 230 feet long with 54-foot ceilings held up by massive Corinthian columns. Tennessee rose-coloured marble covered the floors. Guastavino tiles formed vaulted ceilings that echoed the public baths of ancient Rome. Bronze chandeliers hung from coffered arches. The tower held more than 500 offices for the railroad's business operations. This wasn't just a train station. It was a declaration that Detroit had arrived. And Detroit had arrived. By the 1940s, over 4,000 passengers moved through Michigan Central every day. Immigrants stepping off trains from the east saw the waiting room first, its marble and bronze and soaring spaces promising that America delivered on its reputation. Soldiers left for 2 world wars through those platforms. Presidents arrived: Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman. Charlie Chaplin posed for photographs. Thomas Edison walked through. Henry Ford, whose factories had transformed Detroit into the arsenal of democracy, came to see trains that would soon be obsolete. The highways arrived in the 1950s. Interstate 75 cut through Detroit in 1959, and suddenly driving made more sense than riding the rails. The suburbs sprawled outward. People who had taken trains to work began driving instead. Passenger traffic dropped year after year. By the 1970s, the Grand Waiting Room saw a fraction of the crowds that had filled it during the war. Amtrak took over passenger service in 1971, consolidating routes, cutting schedules. Michigan Central, built for an age when trains were the future, watched that future arrive in the form of automobiles rolling past on the expressway. On January 6, 1988, the last train pulled out of Michigan Central Station. Amtrak relocated its Detroit service to a smaller facility. The building went dark. The Moran family, owners of the Ambassador Bridge, bought the property in 1995 with vague plans for restoration that never materialized. What happened next was slow-motion collapse. Water poured through broken windows. Ice formed in winter and melted in spring, cracking plaster and warping wood. Copper wiring vanished, stripped by scavengers. The grand chandeliers disappeared. Marble panels were pried loose. Trees grew from the roof. The basement flooded with 3.5 million gallons of water that froze solid in winter, creating an ice rink where urban explorers played hockey in a ruined cathedral. Detroit watched its most visible building rot in full view. The station sat less than a mile from downtown. Impossible to miss. Impossible to ignore. It appeared in films as a symbol of urban decay. Photographers from around the world came to document America's most famous ruin. Some Detroiters hated it, this 18-story reminder of everything the city had lost. Others loved it with the fierce protectiveness people reserve for beautiful, broken things. In 2009, the city council ordered the Maroons to tear it down. The building had become dangerous, they said, unstable. A lawsuit blocked the demolition, citing the station's 1975 designation on the National Register of Historic Places. Michigan Central stood, decaying, waiting. Bill Ford grew up in Detroit. His great-grandfather, Henry Ford, had built an automotive empire that made Detroit the wealthiest city in America. Bill Ford became executive chairman of Ford Motor Company in 1999, and he watched his family's company struggle as Detroit struggled. The city filed for bankruptcy in 2013, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. Ford Motor Company survived the 2008 financial crisis without a government bailout, but the company needed to change. The auto industry was changing. Electric vehicles, autonomous driving, mobility services. These weren't distant possibilities anymore. They were coming fast, and Ford needed a place to develop these technologies. In 2017, Ford executives began looking for a site. Silicon Valley was an option. Ann Arbor, home to the University of Michigan's engineering talent, made sense. But Bill Ford kept coming back to Detroit. Not Dearborn, where Ford's world headquarters sat. Detroit itself. The city was finally stabilizing after bankruptcy. Population loss had slowed. Development was returning to downtown. The question was where to put a new innovation campus in a city full of empty buildings. Mayor Mike Duggan had an idea. He knew Ford was looking for space. He also knew that Michigan Central Station had become a national embarrassment, a building so famous for its decay that it appeared in Eminem music videos and disaster films. The Maroons had agreed in 2016 to secure the building and replace its windows to make it more appealing to developers. Duggan approached Ford with a proposition. What if the most famous symbol of Detroit's decline could become a symbol of its renewal? The building Ford executives toured in early 2018 was barely a building anymore. It was a shell filled with debris and water and graffiti. The basement was flooded. Most of the Guastavino tiles had fallen from the ceilings. The steel roof had nearly collapsed. Needles littered the floors. Everything of value that could be removed had been removed. What remained was a ghost, a structure that had been magnificent once and might never be magnificent again. Bill Ford saw something else. He saw a building designed by the same architects who created Grand Central Terminal. He saw Beaux-Arts craftsmanship that couldn't be replicated today. He saw Detroit's oldest neighborhood, Corktown, beginning to revive. He saw a chance to make a statement that Detroit was not yesterday's Rust Belt news, but a place of the future. On June 11, 2018, Ford Motor Company announced it had purchased Michigan Central Station for $90 million. The building would anchor a $950 million project to create a 30-acre innovation district. Ford would restore the station and use it as a centerpiece for developing electric and autonomous vehicle technologies. Startups would work alongside Ford engineers. The first floor would be public space, open to everyone. Detroit would get back one of its most important buildings, and Ford would get a symbol that announced it was betting on the city's future. The announcement created an immediate problem. Residential real estate prices in Corktown jumped 14% within a year. A neighborhood that had been affordable for decades suddenly wasn't. Longtime residents who had stuck with Corktown through its worst years now faced the prospect of being priced out, just as things were getting better. Ford had promised to save a building. Some Detroiters wondered if saving the building would destroy the neighborhood. The first crews that entered Michigan Central Station in December 2018 didn't restore anything. They pumped. 3.5 million gallons of water sat in the basement, more than 5 Olympic swimming pools. The water had been there for years, seeping through broken windows, pooling in foundation levels 3 feet deep. The pumping took weeks. After the water came the debris, 3,990 cubic yards of it. Collapsed plaster, broken tiles, rusted metal, 30 years of decay, hauled out in dump trucks. Then came the waiting. The building had to dry. Concrete foundations saturated with water for decades don't dry quickly. They dry at about 1 inch per month. Engineers waited, monitoring moisture levels, watching as the structure slowly shed the water that had been killing it. While they waited, they planned. Every surface had to be documented. Every architectural detail had to be catalogued. Teams with cameras and measuring tools moved through the wreckage, recording what remained and what was lost. Quinn Evans architects led the design work. They were preservation specialists who understood that restoring Michigan Central meant more than making it look old. It meant making it functional for a completely different purpose than the one it was built for. The waiting room wouldn't see passengers anymore. The ticket windows wouldn't sell tickets. The tower wouldn't house railroad administrators. Ford needed office space, collaboration areas, public gathering places, restaurants, retail. The architects had to preserve the building's character while transforming its function. They started by finding the limestone. Much of the exterior stone had deteriorated beyond repair. Water infiltration had caused spalling, where the surface of the stone flakes away. Freeze-thaw cycles had cracked blocks. Some pieces were simply gone, stolen years ago. The restoration would require over 600 tons of replacement limestone, and not just any limestone. Michigan Central's exterior was built from a specific type called dark hollow rift, quarried in southern Indiana. It had a distinctive grey colour with diagonal cross-grain striations. The pattern was rare. The quarry that produced it, Dark Hollow Quarry, had closed in 1988, the same year the station closed. Ron Staley, Executive Director of Historic Preservation for the Chrisman Brinker joint venture managing construction, had to reopen a quarry that hadn't operated in 30 years. The quarry owners still held the land. When they closed in 1988, they'd left thousands of limestone blocks stacked in the woods, intended for projects that never came. Those blocks had been sitting there for 3 decades. Trees had grown up around them. The access roads had deteriorated. Staley's team rebuilt the roads, cleared the trees, and began extracting stone that had been quarried more than a century ago for a building that hadn't needed it until now. Capital Stoneworks in Bridgeport, Michigan, received the raw limestone blocks. Some pieces weighed over 20 tons. The largest blocks were slabbed in Bloomington, Indiana, cut to required thickness, then shipped to Bridgeport for final shaping. Stonemasons cut the slabs into precise replacement pieces matching the dimensions of the original blocks. Each piece was numbered and sequenced for installation, creating a 3-dimensional puzzle that would eventually cover the station's facade. The most intricate work went to John Goodrow Sr., a master stone carver. He received a 21,000-pound block of dark hollow limestone with instructions to recreate a Corinthian column capital for the main entrance. The original capital had deteriorated and lost most of its detail. Goodrow worked from photographs and measurements, visualizing the finished piece before he ever touched the stone. He carved from the outside in, removing material slowly, creating the acanthus leaves and volutes that characterize Corinthian capitals. The work took 428 hours. When he finished, the capital weighed 11,500 pounds. It was lifted into place at the north entrance, one piece among thousands, each one critical to making the building whole again. Inside, the work was equally painstaking. Of the 29,000 Guastavino tiles that formed the vaulted ceilings in the waiting room and grand hall, about 1,300 had fallen or been destroyed. The remaining tiles were original, installed in 1913. Restorers cleaned each surviving tile, then fabricated replacements for the missing ones. Installing the tiles required 8.7 miles of grout spread across 21,000 square feet of ceiling. Some of the new grout was painted with feathers to blend the new work with the old, creating a seamless surface where you couldn't tell which tiles had been there for 111 years and which had been made last week. The chandeliers were gone, stolen decades ago. Ford's research and advanced engineering teams, people who normally designed automotive components, were reassigned to recreate bronze light fixtures from historical photographs. They used 3D scanning technology to reverse engineer architectural details. Rosettes, filigree, decorative elements that had been ripped off the walls. Ford's engineers scanned surviving examples, created digital models, and 3D printed replacement parts. Some replacements were polymer, not bronze, but detailed enough that you'd need to touch them to know the difference. The floors presented a different problem. The marble in the waiting room was 92% original. Some panels had been stolen. Others were cracked beyond repair. The restoration team found Tennessee rose-coloured marble to match the originals, cut it to size and filled the gaps. The marble showed wear from thousands of shoes that had crossed it between 1913 and 1988. The team decided to keep that wear. It was history, recorded in scuffed stone. Not everything was restored to original condition. Some decisions acknowledged the building's abandonment. In certain areas, graffiti was preserved behind protective coating. These weren't random tags. They were layers of paint and spray paint accumulated over 30 years, a record of who had been here when no one else wanted the place. The architects argued that this graffiti was part of the building's story now, as much as the Boas details. Ford agreed. Some walls would show both the 1913 craftsmanship and the 1990s urban explorers who had made this building their canvas. 3,100 workers cycled through the project over 6 years. Electricians installed 300 miles of wire and cable. Plumbers ran 5.6 miles of new piping. Window specialists replaced or restored 102,000 square feet of glass. Masons restored 1,300 square feet of terracotta cornice. Lighting installers mounted 4,200 new fixtures. Every trade had its specialists. Every specialist had a piece of the puzzle. The COVID-19 pandemic hit in March 2020, shutting down work for months. When crews returned, they worked under new protocols, masks and distancing and schedule changes that slowed everything down. The original completion date of 2022 slipped to 2023, then to 2024. The delays frustrated everyone, but they also gave the restoration teams more time to get details right. This wasn't a job you rushed. It was a job you did correctly once because there wouldn't be a second chance. By June 2024, Michigan Central Station looked better than it had in 1913. The limestone facade was clean and complete. The waiting room's vaulted ceilings were perfect. The marble floors gleamed. The 3 recreated bronze chandeliers hung where the originals had hung, casting light across a space that had been dark for 36 years. Workers who had been there since 2018 walked through the finished building and didn't recognize it. This was the thing they'd been building, but seeing it complete was different from seeing it in pieces. Some of them cried. Ford scheduled the reopening for June 6, 2024. They planned a concert in Roosevelt Park, the green space that fronted the station. Diana Ross headlined, Eminem performed, Jack White and Big Sean played. 40,000 people attended, more people than had probably ever gathered at Michigan Central at one time, even during its busiest days in the 1940s. The event was broadcast on Peacock. Detroiters who couldn't get tickets watched from home. The message was clear. This building, which had been a symbol of everything Detroit had lost, was now a symbol of what Detroit could build again. Starting June 7th, public tours opened. Tickets sold out within minutes. Over the next 10 days, thousands of Detroiters walked through the waiting room and saw the Guastavino tiles and stood in spaces their grandparents had stood in. Some visitors remembered using the station before it closed. They remembered buying tickets at the windows, waiting on wooden benches boarding trains for Chicago or New York. Others had only known the building as a ruin, the thing you saw from the highway, and wondered if it would ever be anything else. The building they walked through was no longer a train station. The platforms were sealed off, probably permanently. Amtrak has discussed returning passenger rail service to Michigan Central, but those are discussions, not plans. What the building is now is harder to define. The first floor is public space. There's a coffee shop, a food court, areas for events and exhibitions. The upper floors are offices, though not all of them are occupied yet. Ford employees work in the tower, developing mobility technologies. The exact number of Ford workers in the building isn't public, but it's nowhere near the 2,500 Ford initially projected for the campus. Adjacent to the station, in a 1926 building formerly used as a Detroit Public Schools book depository, is New Lab. This is a startup incubator focused on mobility and transportation technologies. Over 600 people work there, representing about 100 companies. Many of these companies are working on advanced aerial mobility, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, autonomous delivery systems. New Lab provides them with testing facilities, connections to Ford and other partners, and access to what Ford calls the Transportation Innovation Zone. This is a regulatory framework that allows companies to test new technologies faster than they could elsewhere. Want to test a delivery drone? Normally that involves years of permits. Here, it happens in months. The vision Ford articulated in 2018 was that Michigan Central would bring together startups, established companies, universities, and Ford itself. They would collaborate on technologies that would define the future of transportation. That's happening, but slowly. The automotive industry's transition to electric vehicles has been slower than many predicted. Autonomous driving has proven more difficult than tech companies thought. The technologies that were supposed to be deployed by 2024 are still in testing. Michigan Central is betting that when those technologies arrive, they'll be developed here. That bet might take another decade to pay off. Some floors of the station remain empty. There are plans, always plans, for hotels and additional retail and more office space. Some of those plans require zoning changes that haven't been approved. Others depend on economic conditions that haven't materialised. The building is functional, but it's not full. That might be fine. Buildings like this take time to grow into their purposes. Grand Central Terminal wasn't built to its current configuration in one phase. It evolved. Michigan Central might too. The $950 million Ford spent on Michigan Central came with $300 million in state and local tax incentives. That's a normal part of large development projects, but it raises questions about priorities. Detroit is a city where tens of thousands of people live in poverty. Entire neighbourhoods lack basic services. Houses sit abandoned, not because people don't want them, but because they're too damaged to be habitable. Some Detroiters looked at $950 million being spent on one building and wondered why that money couldn't fix neighbourhoods instead. Ford's response was that the money wouldn't have been available to fix neighbourhoods. The $950 million was private investment tied to a specific project. Without the project, there's no investment. The tax incentives, Ford argued, would be repaid through increased property values and economic activity in Corktown. More businesses would open. More people would work in the area. Property tax revenue would increase. The city would get back more than it gave up. That logic is standard in economic development. It's also where the gentrification concerns come in. Property values in Corktown didn't just increase, they jumped. Residents who had lived in Corktown for decades because it was affordable suddenly found themselves in a neighbourhood where rent had doubled in 2 years. Some sold their homes and made money they never expected to make. Others couldn't sell because they were renters, and rising rents meant they had to leave. Torian Thomas grew up in Clement Kern Gardens, a Section 8 subsidised housing complex on Bagley Street. His mother still lives there. The complex sits on 7 acres in historic Corktown, valuable land in a neighbourhood where land values have skyrocketed. Thomas watches development spreading through Corktown and wonders what happens to places like Clement Kern Gardens. The building isn't going anywhere soon, but in 10 years, 20 years, will it still be affordable housing? Or will economic pressure push it toward market rate units, displacing the people who lived there when nobody else wanted to? Detroit passed a community benefits ordinance in 2016. It requires developers who receive tax incentives over $1 million for projects valued above $75 million to negotiate with surrounding communities about benefits to offset negative impacts. Ford went through this process. Community meetings were held. Residents voiced concerns about affordable housing, gentrification, displacement. Ford committed $11 million to neighbourhood projects and affordable housing initiatives. They're working with non-profits on workforce development. They've created youth programming space in the station's tower. Sheila Cockrell, president of the Train Station Neighbours Block Club, was involved in the community outreach process. She served on Detroit City Council from 1994 to 2009. She remembers walking with her father to buy the New York Times at Michigan Central when she was a child. She's seen Corktown's entire arc, from thriving neighbourhood to abandoned buildings to whatever it's becoming now. She says Ford has been diligent about following through on community benefits. The $11 million is being spent. The commitments are being honoured, but she's also cautious about celebrating too early. The real test is whether those 5,000 jobs Ford projected for 2028 actually materialise, and whether those jobs go to Detroiters who need them. The Greater Corktown Framework Plan, created by the city in 2019 after extensive community engagement, has one clear goal stated at the top of its recommendations: zero residential displacement. The plan acknowledges that Corktown has enough vacant land to accommodate new development without pushing out existing residents. There are 434 parcels owned by the Detroit Land Bank in North Corktown alone. Most of those parcels are vacant land. The framework argues you can build new housing on vacant land, create economic opportunity, and preserve affordability if you plan carefully. Whether that happens depends on political will and economic forces that don't always align with planning documents. Gentrification isn't a switch someone flips. It's a process driven by market forces, investment decisions, policy choices, and individual circumstances. A long-time resident might sell their house because they see an opportunity to cash out. A landlord might raise rent because comparable units down the street are charging more. New residents move in because they are attracted to improving neighbourhoods. None of these individual decisions are wrong, but collectively they can transform a community in ways that leave some people behind. Maria Salinas runs Congress of Communities, an organisation based in southwest Detroit. She's watching development spread beyond Corktown. New investment is coming to southwest. New residents are arriving. Her role, she says, is to make sure resident voices are part of development decisions, not afterthoughts. Too often, she says, development happens to communities, not with them. Residents experience changes they didn't ask for and can't control. Her organisation's approach is to get residents to the table before decisions are made, to ensure that the people who know the neighbourhood best have a say in what it becomes. This is the complexity Ford bought when it purchased Michigan Central. The company didn't just buy a building. It bought a role in a neighbourhood's future and by extension a piece of Detroit's ongoing struggle to grow in ways that include everyone. That's harder than restoring Guastavino tiles. You can't 3D scan community trust. You can't reinstall it like limestone panels. It's built slowly through consistent action, through following through on commitments, through listening when residents say the benefits they were promised aren't reaching them. Michigan Central Station is 640,000 square feet of space with a complicated mandate. It's supposed to be a technology hub, a community gathering place, a symbol of Detroit's resurgence, and a profitable real estate investment. Those purposes don't always align. Technology hubs optimize for productivity and collaboration among workers developing cutting-edge products. Community gathering places optimize for accessibility and public use. Symbols optimize for visibility and meaning. Profitable real estate optimizes for revenue per square foot. The building has to be all of these things, and the tensions between them will shape what Michigan Central becomes. One thing is certain. The building exists again. For 30 years, Michigan Central was America's most famous abandoned building. It appeared in every list of urban ruins, every photo essay about Detroit's decline. It was the image people associated with the city, often the only image people outside Detroit knew. That image is gone now. The building is clean and functional and beautiful. Whether that's enough depends on what question you're asking. For Ford, success means creating technologies that keep the company competitive in an industry being transformed by electrification and automation. If engineers at Michigan Central develop battery systems or autonomous driving, algorithms that Ford can monetize, the $950 million investment pays off. If they don't, it's an expensive exercise in corporate philanthropy and public relations. For Detroit, success means economic development that creates jobs and tax revenue without displacing the people who stayed in the city when it was losing 25,000 residents a year. It means Corktown growing in ways that benefit longtime residents, not just newcomers. It means the restoration of Michigan Central becoming a catalyst for broader neighbourhood investment that doesn't price people out of their own communities. For Detroiters who grew up with the ruined station as part of their landscape, success might be simpler. It might just be walking through the waiting room and seeing it whole again. Seeing the building their grandparents used, that presidents and celebrities and immigrants and soldiers moved through, looking the way it was meant to look. That has value beyond economics. It's the reclamation of civic pride, the restoration of a shared landmark that reminds people their city was once great and could be great again. The building's second life is just beginning. What happens next will be written by the people who work there, the startups that test technologies there, the Detroiters who visit there, the policy decisions made about housing and development in Corktown, and the broader economic forces that shape cities everywhere. Some of those factors Ford can control, many it can't. In 1913, Michigan Central Station opened as a bet that Detroit's future was bright. The building was meant to handle growth, to welcome the immigrants and workers who would make Detroit the richest city in America. That bet paid off for decades. Then the city changed, and the building became a monument to what happens when bets go bad. The 30 years of abandonment were a different kind of monument, a reminder that nothing lasts, that progress doesn't move in straight lines, that buildings designed to be permanent can become ruins in a single generation. Ford's $950 million bet is that Detroit's story isn't over. The city has stabilized. Population loss has slowed. Development is returning to neighborhoods that were written off. The auto industry is transforming, and Detroit has a chance to lead that transformation the way it led the last one. Michigan Central Station is the physical embodiment of that bet, a building that refused to die getting a second chance to matter. The resurrection of Michigan Central required reopening quarries and hand-carving limestone and 3D scanning architectural details, and 1.7 million hours of labour from 3,000 workers. It required believing that a ruin could become whole again, that the craftsmanship of 1913 could be preserved in 2024, that a building designed for one purpose could serve another. Those things are difficult but achievable. They require money and skill and determination, all of which Ford had. What comes next requires something harder. It requires figuring out how a restored landmark fits into a city where 30% of residents live below the poverty line. It requires balancing the forces that make neighbourhoods attractive with the forces that make them unaffordable. It requires delivering on promises made to communities that have heard promises before. It requires turning architectural triumph into shared prosperity, which is always harder than restoring buildings. Michigan Central Station stands complete. The limestone is clean, the chandeliers hang, the marble gleams, the building is magnificent again. Whether magnificence is enough is the question Detroit is still asking.